advise you to please sign up for that. So Ken is the advisor for policy and planning in the office of the president at the International Rescue Committee, a global humanitarian organization supporting people whose lives have been shattered by conflict and disaster in more than 30 countries around the world. Prior to working at the IRC, Ken was the associate director for national security and international policy at the Center for American Progress, a public diplomacy think tank based in Washington, D.C. Ken received a master's in public affairs from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University, where he studied international affairs in science, technology, and environmental policy. Ken is an alum of the USC School of International Relations, class of 2010, where he focused on US policy and Middle East politics. He's previously studied in Amman, Jordan, and Egypt, and he currently lives in Brooklyn, New York. So I'll hand that over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Natalia, and thank you all for joining. I know you're spending a lot of time staring at computer screens on Zoom meetings, so I applaud you for voluntarily joining another one. Just thank you so much for taking the time, and I'm really happy to be speaking to all of you. As Natalia mentioned, I graduated from USC in 2010. I took Professor Lamy's class over a decade ago, his IR 210 class, and absolutely fell in love with international relations theory, international politics. I am, to be honest, shocked at how much I still talk about IR theory, even in my current job, much more than I ever thought I would while I was taking this class, much more than I ever thought I would when I took this current job. Yeah, so, I'm really, really happy to be talking to all of you, and just sort of happy to kind of answer questions about the current work I'm doing with the International Rescue Committee and sort of the humanitarian issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, as well as sort of my broader career trajectory. And I can kind of walk through that a little bit just so you kind of understand my background a little bit more. And then, like I said, I'll talk for just a few minutes, and then I think let's leave most of the time for questions. As mentioned, so I went to USC. I'm originally from Hermosa Beach, California, for those of you that have been to the beach down there. Went to USC, focused on IR and poli-sci, was really, really focused on the Middle East at the time. My, dad's side of the family, my grandparents are Iraqi Jewish refugees. And so that was obviously in the middle of the Iraq War. I was really, really focused on what was happening there, and really wanted to kind of better understand the world around me. I mean, obviously, like everyone in my generation, it kind of came into a lot of my consciousness about international affairs during post 9/11 and the Iraq War. So that was really top of my mind, and why I really focused on that at USC. I was studying Arabic at the time, but loved the time I had there. Got to study abroad in Egypt for a semester, where I also took Arabic. And when I graduated in 2010, I was trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. I knew that I cared about international affairs. I knew I cared about U.S. foreign policy, and specifically the ways that U.S. policy could, help make the world a better place around it, or make the world the worst place around it, depending on the policy levers we chose and decisions that the U.S. government made. I understood, obviously what a huge and outsized role the U.S. plays in geopolitics around the world. And so I wanted to really focus on how to improve U.S. foreign policy, how to make better decisions, especially coming out of the Iraq War and kind of all the mistakes that were made there. I immediately moved to DC without a job. I had an unpaid internship on the Hill with Senator Feinstein's office, and really enjoyed that experience, sort of getting to know what it was like to actually be on the Hill. That's a really strange environment, Congress. And I think your colleague Riley is currently working there, can tell you what a strange environment it is, but really getting to be there on a day-to-day basis, even as an intern, just sort of understanding kind of, how policies get made, how laws get passed, how how politics are formed, was really interesting. But I also sort of got to understand that so much of foreign policy is made outside the formal structures of government, right? It's not just the White House and Congress that makes foreign policy and shapes foreign policy. It's all these other institutions that are around it that are feeding ideas in. And I ended up going to one of those institutions, which is a think tank called the Center for American Progress. I got a job there as a special assistant for national security. Basically, I was a glorified scheduler for the vice president of the team. I got coffee, I handled his schedule, I printed out documents for him, things like that. But on the side, as I sort of in between getting coffee, he would ask me to sort of help him with a research project here and there, and maybe write a few lines for an op-ed that he was working on, and maybe write a section of a report he was working on. And bit by bit, I got a chance to sort of prove myself and prove through my writing and my research skills what I could do. And in a think tank, or sort of any NGO or nonprofit, you're going to find that everyone is sort of stretched to their absolute limit and no one has any extra capacity. So when you volunteer and say, I will gladly work my nights and weekends to do a little bit more stuff on this, people will gladly hand you a lot of work. And that's basically what I did. When I was there early on during the Syrian civil war, but it was really before Syria became the focus. Everyone was a lot more focused on Egypt, and we as an organization didn't have as many people really focused on Syria. So I sort of raised my hand and said, hey, can I help do a little bit, lead some of the writing of our Syria policy work? And they said, that's fine, because we don't have any capacity to do that. So, as long as you can run it by some of the senior fellows, you're welcome to do that. And as Syria really took off as the kind of big focal point issue that we were focused on as an organization, I sort of got swept into that and sort of worked my way up from being a special assistant getting coffee to being a person who was helping shape and write our sort of institutional policy on what the U.S. position in Syria could be. I was writing memos that were going to the White House at the time. I was writing memos that were going to the Secretary of State, and trying to influence what the U.S. government was doing at the time. At my time at part, one of the things I really started to realize was a few things. One, I realized that while I could sort of learn any subject matter kind of on the fly in my job, I studied Middle East politics in undergrad, but I was getting, Russia invaded Ukraine while I was there, and they sort of asked me to work on that. And I never worked on Russia or Ukraine policy, but realized I could sort of, with the skill set I had developed and learned from Professor Lamy's class and others, I could quickly learn about different international relations, foreign affairs topics, even those outside of my professional expertise. But what I realized I couldn't do on the fly was pick up some of the sort of harder skills, economics, econometrics, quantitative analysis, understanding sort of statistical models, things like that, that were potentially valuable to my work, but were just things that I didn't have training in. And so I ended up going to grad school at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, which is a public policy school. I did a 2-year master's there and really focused in on, okay, let me get better at quantitative analysis. Let me get better on econometrics. Let me really round out my economics training. And out of that, was trying to figure out kind of what I wanted to do with that degree. And I'd been working in foreign policy for a long time, but what I realized was, my conception of what was in U.S. national security interests and U.S. national interests was much wider than I think a lot of the foreign policy community in D.C. was willing to define it. And the tools that I felt like, the U.S. and others should be using were sort of a wider set of tools than I think most people in the sort of D.C. national security foreign policy community were often relying on. And what I realized that I was really interested in supporting refugees and humanitarian issues. And as I mentioned, my grandparents, they're Iraqi Jewish refugees. Obviously, I'd been working a lot on Syria and the refugee situation there when I was at CAP. And then when I was in grad, I did a lot of work on the way that climate change would impact state fragility and stability. And a lot of that's through forced migration. So I'd sort of been tangentially working on humanitarian and refugee issues, but never directly working on it. And when my partner and I decided that we were going to be in New York after I graduated, from grad school. She was going to law school here in New York. There are a lot of great humanitarian organizations that work closely with the UN and thus are based in New York. And I quickly identified the International Rescue Committee as the organization I was most interested in. And part of that's their sort of focus, the reputation they had. I had a lot of friends and colleagues from grad school who had worked in refugee camps in Zaatari, and I sort of asked them, like, which organizations actually do the best work? Which ones are not just, name and reputation, but are actually doing really good quality programming work? And a lot of them pointed me to the IRC. So I ended up sort of doing a lot of informational interviews. I applied for a lot of jobs, but I was determined to get a job there. And eventually was told that there was going to be this job opening up in the president's office. And I hadn't really planned for that or expected that or been aiming for that. But I did an informational interview with the woman who's my current boss, who's effectively the chief of staff of the organization. And we really clicked, we hit it off, and she ended up hiring me for this job. And that's been a just fantastic experience getting to work on humanitarian policy, being really focused on the sort of values that are really important to me without necessarily dealing with the sort of political side of it. And it sort of allowed me to travel in a way that, when I was working at the think tank, I got to do a lot of travel. But, when you travel with a think tank, mostly what you're doing is you go to a country capital, you speak to government officials, you speak to some academics, a few other think tankers. You never really leave the sort of government buildings were sort of 5-star hotels, right? You know, and I went to China twice with CAP, and I can't really tell you what China's like. You know, I've been there for 20 days, and I didn't really meet anyone outside of the top 0.1% of Chinese society. So I really have no idea what that country's like. Contrast that with the travel I do with my current job. I mean, I went to rural Northeast Nigeria, kind of right on the front lines of the Boko Haram fight. I went to El Salvador and San Salvador, and really got to meet a lot of people that were been directly affected by the gang violence there that we're supporting. I spent 2 weeks in the kind of center of the kind of Ebola outbreak in eastern Congo. Going kind of from rural village to rural village, seeing the programming we're doing, getting to meet not just sort of our clients and beneficiaries we work with, but you know, my colleagues who are Congolese staff. You know, they're Congolese doctors or Congolese people from these communities. So, you know, I've gotten to just sort of meet a wider cross section of people and sort of get to understand a lot of these issues much better because of the type of travel I've been doing. And happy to talk about that a little bit more. But this has just been a really eye-opening experience, getting an opportunity to work directly in humanitarian affairs. And obviously now with, you know, the COVID-19 crisis, it's pretty much everything I'm thinking about and doing is figuring out how do we support people whose lives are going to be shattered by this, you know, crisis. We put out a analysis on yesterday, actually, that basically projected we think about up to 1 billion people will be infected with the disease in the 34 countries we operate in with, you know, if the fatality rates are close to what it was in China, I mean, it'd be about 3 million people dying. So, you know, this is all we're thinking about and doing is how do we support people and you know, prevent people, you know, save people's lives and save their livelihoods. So, I mean, this has been such a fantastic experience getting to work on this. Like I mentioned, there's the really tangible stuff I get to work on a day-to-day basis, but the nature of the work that I do a lot of speech writing with my boss, and, you know, we do a lot of thinking about, for instance, how is COVID going to impact the sort of balance of power in geopolitics, and what does that mean for our work and our beneficiaries? If there's sort of less, if sort of there's declining U.S. hegemony in the UN Security Council, what does that mean for protection of refugee and migrant rights if China and Russia have greater power relative to the U.S.? If the U.S. and the EU are sort of less aligned on foreign policy, what does that mean for humanitarian aid? Does that mean more politicized humanitarian aid? So I'm actually thinking on using a lot of IR theory on a day-to-day basis as we try to think about some of these big picture issues. But sort of getting to do both the theoretical and the really practical has been really nice in that job. So that's a bit of my sort of career arc. But why don't I sort of open it up to questions, and happy to talk about sort of any element of that. Natalia, I don't know if you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you for doing that. Could we, if you have a question, just put the hand thing up, and also identify yourself and maybe your major, so Ken knows a little bit about you. Don't go into your lifelong history, just name and major and ask your question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we can go to Jenna, then to Kate, Lola, and then Victoria.
Cool. Hi, I'm Jenna. Thank you for coming. I've been interested in the IRC basically all of college, so I'm really excited to hear about your work there. I'm a senior majoring in international relations and Spanish, and I've also been doing a lot of informational interviews kind of on how to go into international development, humanitarian aid, and it seems like you basically need an advanced degree to go into policy or any type of humanitarian work. So I was wondering if you have any suggestions for skills or types of jobs, like skills to acquire or jobs to be looking for pre-grad school that can still set you up for success in humanitarian work later.
Thanks for that question, Jenna. And just out of curiosity, are you interested in working with sort of in the humanitarian space in the field? So, you know, working abroad or working kind of based out of the US and sort of traveling as needed?
I think honestly both at different points.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, what I basically say is, you know, of the sort of 17,000 staff that the IRC has worldwide, I mean, 99% of them are working in the field, right? And most of them are, you know, they're health coordinators in, you know, rural South Sudan. They're, you know, early childhood education specialists in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, right? But our headquarters are in New York. And we also have kind of big offices in London, Nairobi, Bangkok, Amman, Jordan, you know, Brussels, DC. And so what you end up sort of having is a sort of kind of institutional structures, the communications, advocacy, things like that tend to be sort of US based. And then the actual work happens in the field. Whether you want to be in the field, whether you want to be in headquarters, that's probably the big divide to really think about. And obviously that's a big lifestyle change. You know, I think that if I was graduating from undergrad, you know, I definitely seriously consider trying to spend some time abroad where, you know, when I was graduating from college, you know, I wasn't married, I, you know, didn't have an apartment, you know, that, or a lease or anything like that I had to worry about. I had no sort of other obligations. Things are really tying me to the US, you know, parents in good health, things like that. But, you know, obviously now, you know, I don't want to be living in rural Northeast Nigeria, although I have a lot of colleagues that, you know, that are from kind of Western backgrounds that do. In terms of your question about whether you need a grad degree to get involved in this, the experience that I've had is that working in the field, no, not necessarily. You don't need a grad degree to kind of work in the field, right? What I've found in sort of it's the more policy space, which is sort of what I've been working in, where I found that you don't need a grad degree to start, but you will sort of quickly hit a ceiling. And just as a quick anecdote, so I was working at the Center for American Progress. It was a think tank. I was a junior, you know, staffer, like I said, mostly getting coffee and doing a little bit of research. And while I was at CAP, I was applying for jobs in the Obama administration at the time. And, you know, and pretty much every job I applied for was basically told, you know, you don't have an advanced degree, so we're not even really going to consider your application. And they were really basically like, we don't care what your advanced degree is, you know, PhD, law degree, MBA, you know, master's, like, we don't really care as long as it's some advanced degree. And that's part of the reason I went to grad school, is to sort of get into that next phase from the more junior set of positions into the more kind of middle management set of positions. The one exception I would say to that is if you're sort of coming in from, you know, Congress or a campaign where it's sort of, you know, loyalty and longevity with a particular person kind of substitutes for an advanced degree. So I'll say that. In terms of things that you could do sort of without a grad degree that I think are really attractive, I mean, if you're wanting to work in the field, the biggest thing is you need to show that you can actually work and function abroad. I think that's the biggest worry that we have, is we're going to send someone that is very well intentioned, that is very smart and means well, and they realize, you know, they step foot off the airplane and realize, like, this is absolutely not something that I can handle. So things that you can do, you know, language programs abroad. You know, I did a summer-long language program in Jordan, but, you know, there's sort of a variety of different language programs you could do, kind of spending time abroad. You know, foreign fellowships, Peace Corps, things like that. There's like the Princeton in Asia program. So there's all these sort of different one-year-long programs you could do to just show, like, look, I've lived abroad. I've lived in, you know, fragile countries, low-income countries, and I function fine. You know, I have the cultural competency. I think that's a really important one. I obviously, you know, I don't come from a humanitarian background and still came into this job. And so some of it's also thinking about, you know, not every job in a humanitarian organization is going to want someone from a humanitarian background. I mean, just to give you an idea, at our organization, we have a whole, it's called the strategy unit. It's effectively management consulting, but just sort of in-house. So everyone there has a McKinsey, BCG background, but now works on humanitarian issues, figuring out how do we be more effective as an organization, more competitive for grants and contracts, things like that. How do we deliver better programs for our beneficiaries? So, I just say, you know, that as well. Like, not every job has to have that sort of pure humanitarian background, and there are sort of a lot of different pathways in. Who is the next question?
Kate.
Yes. Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for being here. You've done a lot to get to where you are. So I was kind of wondering, what has been in your opinion, the most valuable experience that you've had that has, like, shaped what you want to do and has helped you get to where you currently are?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think probably studying abroad was the thing that really did it for me, just in terms of, you know, I was in Egypt, I was living in Cairo, I was studying Arabic, you know, I was in this place that I'd sort of been studying and hearing about and spending all my time thinking and reading about, but I was physically there. And obviously it's just such a different experience to be physically somewhere and sort of around that 24/7 and getting to meet a lot of students from different backgrounds and different perspectives. And, you know, like, you know, I think especially as someone that, you know, believes in the promise and potential of what the U.S. can do. Maybe you all have a different perspective, sort of, you know, during this administration and the, you know, what's happened over the last few years, but, you know, it still had a lot of faith in what the U.S. could do, and sort of meeting a lot of people that have been more directly affected, right? Palestinian refugees that were from Lebanon that were studying there, you know, people that were from Iraq that had been sort of displaced by the war. You know, I think that's really eye-opening, and sort of getting a better sense of backgrounds, perspectives. So I think that was really powerful because I think just getting introduced to people from those different backgrounds really kind of supercharged my interest in the world around me. There was a lot of really interesting stuff that was going on at the time. That was, you know, when Netanyahu first, you know, came back into power in Israel. I mean, that was when I was studying abroad, which gives you an idea of how long he's been prime minister for. But, you know, there were sort of a few big changes that were happening around at that time, and seeing it from the perspective of being in the Middle East, I think was really powerful. So that one was a really powerful experience. And the other one, I think, just in terms of professional experiences, I mean, I think that the first time, you know, my first internship in DC was interning at the State Department after the summer after my junior year. I got a stipend from USC to do that, which has sort of allowed me to take the unpaid internship, you know, living in DC, and that was really valuable. And I think that was the first time I sort of realized, okay, I can do this. You know, I can fit in here. You know, I obviously being born and raised on the West Coast, going to school on the West Coast, I think that I had a bit of trepidation about moving out to the East Coast, and you know, could I cut this? Was this something that I actually wanted to do? And was this an environment I could be in? And I think that really proved to me, yes, I'm fully capable of doing this. And I think that gave me a lot of confidence heading into the job hunt after I graduated.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. Next.
Hi there. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Lele, a junior double majoring in international relations and French. And my question is it's somewhat related to Jenna's, but I was wondering more logistically about pursuing a master's. Do you have any advice about when to do that? Like right after undergrad, full-time, you know, taking a break a couple of years into your career, part-time during your career? Any thoughts?
Yeah. So I'll say that I applied for many different grad schools when I was a senior in college, trying to go in straight after, and I got rejected from every single one of them. And that ended up being sort of a blessing in disguise, because I basically ended up getting into Princeton, going there, you know, after working for you know, 4 years or so, and I think that ended up being the right decision. Obviously, it depends on the type of program. You know, obviously, a lot of people will go right into a PhD out of undergrad. A lot of people go into law school right out of undergrad. You know, if you're getting an MBA, that tends to be a little bit further out. Master's a bit mixed. My master's program, I think the average age of people there was, you know, 27 or 28. We had a very small, you know, 4 or 5 people in my class that were right out of undergrad, and then some people that were sort of in their mid 30s. But sort of most people sort of in their late 20s, they've been working for a few years. And I think that that's, I mean, I'm obviously biased for my personal experience, but I highly recommend that. It just, one, you know, working for a few years and getting a little bit of income before going, I think, you know, helps the financial security of being allowed to sort of decide what you want to do. It made a lot of things a lot easier. 2, the time working really sharpened what I was interested in and what I was not interested in. What skills I didn't need grad school for, and what skills I needed grad school for. And like I mentioned, you know, I didn't need to go to grad school because, wow, you know, if I ever want to work on, you know, Asia policy, I have to take a million Asia policy classes. I'm never going to learn that on the fly. Like, I actually realized that I could learn, you know, I did a lot of work on China, US-China policy when I was at CAP, because that's just what was asked of me. And I did a lot of reading, and I didn't need to go to formal classes for that. But, you know, understanding statistical models, understanding, you know, how to read, you know, statistical tables and, you know, p-values and stuff like that for econometrics, like that stuff I definitely needed to go to grad school for. And so that, I think, was helpful in just in terms of shaping what I wanted to focus on. You know, and I think also just in terms of your energy and enthusiasm for it, I mean, I don't know, I mean, maybe you're all better students than I am, but I don't know that I would have had the energy, enthusiasm, or commitment to really do grad school very well coming right out of undergrad. I think I just would have been too exhausted of like going to class, taking tests, stuff like that. well, working for a few years, working tangibly on a day-to-day basis, and then getting to go back into school where I didn't have to worry about, you know, what side of the bed my boss woke up on and like what random things were going to fall on my desk that morning that were going to blow up my entire day. Like getting a piece of paper that said, here's all the things that we're going to ask from you from August through December, and none of that's going to change. Like that was incredible. And I was so excited to be back in school. I was so excited to be reading IR theory again. I mean, it was a really, really fun experience. That was the experience I think most of my classmates had, was they just loved being back in school after having a few years off of it. So highly encourage that. But you know, obviously everyone's circumstances are going to be a little bit different.
Thank you.
Victoria, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Tori Hubin. I'm a senior here majoring in English and International Relations. You've mentioned a lot of your experience across the board between Egypt and China, but I was wondering specifically for development and humanitarian issues, would you recommend specializing in one specific region, or is it more beneficial to have a broader and more diverse work background in it?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that, so this is very much I wouldn't take this as gospel, it's just very much my personal opinion. And, you know, I think that there's an overemphasis on forcing people to specialize really early on, really, really deep, right? Because when you're coming out of undergrad, if you apply for a job and you say, look, I like international affairs and I think about the world and I don't really know any of it super well, but I know some of it everywhere, your odds of getting a job are pretty low. But if you say, look, I'm a Turkey specialist and I speak Turkish and it's the only thing I think about and I studied abroad there and it's the only thing I live, eat, and sleep, and I only eat Turkish food, I only drink raka, like if you're applying for a specific Turkey-focused job, right, your odds of getting a job are really high. So there's a huge incentive factor to specialize really fast. But I mean, my experience has been one, I mean, I'll just say, I hate specializing. Like, I like being a generalist. And part of it is that I think that there's a value of figuring out how all the different pieces connect. So when I was at CAP and working on the national security team, you know, there were Middle East policy experts that knew way more about Middle East policy than I did. And there were Asia policy experts that knew way more about Asia policy than I did. But when I was with the Middle East team, I would talk about what China's, you know, how China's thinking about its position in the world and what China's relationship is with oil and energy prices, and thus what China might be thinking in terms of Persian Gulf security, right? So it's very much different perspective I'm bringing in. When I was with the Asia folks, I was thinking about, let's talk about what sort of instability, what sort of Saudi-Iranian relations are like, what are the odds that, you know, oil stops flowing out of the Persian Gulf and how that might affect the Chinese economy, right? So bringing in a different perspective, trying to figure out how the pieces come together, I think is really valuable. And I really enjoyed that. It's something that I think has a lot of value. And I think that the overemphasis on specializing early on, I think takes away from that. But I'm not gonna lie to you, I mean, there are huge incentives to specialize. Two other things I'll say on this. One is that even if you're hyper-specialized in an area, if you don't have the ability to learn about a topic which you have very little background in, I think you're gonna struggle in any job you have, right? Because no matter what job you take, even if it's you know, I'm a Turkey specialist and Turkey is the only thing I do, and you get a job on Turkey, there's probably gonna be some issue that you're gonna have to deal with, like, okay, well, you know, what are Turkey-EU migration relations? So you need to learn about EU migration policy. I mean, if you're a Turkey specialist, maybe you know a little bit about that, but you're gonna have to learn some stuff on the fly. So there's no escaping having to learn stuff outside of your area of expertise. So I think it's another incentive to have a little bit of that, a little bit more flexibility and a little less rigidity in terms of your specialty. The last thing I'll say is that a piece of advice I got from a friend who's a few years ahead of me in her career, she described kind of specialization over the course of your career as sort of having an hourglass shape. You start early on in your career as a generalist, right? You're sort of working on a bunch of random stuff. You're getting pulled in a million different directions. As you get further and further into your career, you start specializing more and more. And I'm sort of in that process, right? Where I'm more focused on humanitarian and refugee issues, and I'll probably be in something related to this space for a while. You specialize more and more. And then as you get more senior, you end up having to generalize again, right? If you want to be Secretary of State, it's great that you're a Turkey specialist, but you still have to work on Asia policy, right? So, you know, you'll have that sort of natural forced specialization and forced generalization again. So I think that as you're sort of figuring out how much do I specialize and have maybe some anxiety about that, I think just thinking about the fact that you're not necessarily going to be stuck in one space for the rest of your career, but it may be valuable to have one policy issue, which is your sort of base, and you can kind of build out from there and sort of build on top of that bit by bit.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
We can go Angela, Robert, and then Pascal.
You might want to be quickly get part of your questions out so everybody gets a chance.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kim. First of all, thank you so much for speaking with us. So I'm currently a senior majoring in IR and also doing a progressive master's degree in studies in law. I guess my question is a bit more general. I was just wondering whether there's any change, like what kind of changes you've noticed sort of in like your current job area and job industry with the pandemic, and if you have any advice for how students can adapt their job search process in that situation.
Yeah, and I just say that, you know, for those of you that are graduating, and to be honest, I think most of you that are juniors are going to be graduating, you know, next year. I have a lot of sympathy for the sort of job and the kind of environment you're graduating into. I graduated in 2010, not at the peak of the financial crisis in 2008, but still very much feeling the effects of it in a really tight job market, and had a lot of friends that really struggled getting a job. I was one of the luckier ones that you know, was able to pretty quickly get a job. Like I mentioned, you know, worked an unpaid internship for a while, but pretty quickly got a job after I moved out to DC. So just to say that, you know, I'm feeling for all of you that are graduating, sort of navigating this hunt. And I think the, you know, real challenge is right now where most organizations aren't really sure where things are going to go. They don't know what their sort of income is going to be. They don't know how much money they're going to have. And so it's hard for them to plan right now. I think a little bit later on, once they have a better sense of sort of the kind of ebbs and flow of this crisis, things will differ. You know, for me in the IRC, I know I've been really, really lucky. Just, you know, most of our funding comes through, you know, government grants, you know, so USAID, DFID, which is sort of their humanitarian aid organization, their sort of a version of USAID in the UK, ECHO, which is the EU's kind of ODA arm. They have actually, you know, been sort of ramping up funding because they know that this is going to hit the countries where we work in. So, you know, we've had a lot more expenses to deal with. You know, we've had to, you know, we just submitted a purchase for $1 million worth of PPE, you know, for our health responders. You know, there's a lot of stuff like that we're having to deal with, but luckily, the sort of income has not really gone down. So I've been really lucky that we haven't had, you know, major job, you know, layoffs or salary cuts or things like that, which has been really lucky. But, you know, that's always going to depend. You know, if you're working for, you know, a state or city government that has to have a balanced budget, like obviously that's going to get hit a lot harder. Federal government, obviously not as much. So if you're looking for jobs, you know, State Department, things like that. I mean, there will be probably some, you know, budget cuts at some point, but it's not going to be as severe. And if you're working in a sort of foreign policy, national security space, you know, for better or for worse, it's a growth market, you know, and certainly in the humanitarian space, for better or for worse, it's a growth market. So luckily it hasn't hit us that hard, but in terms of getting a job, keeping a job, but in terms of the work we're doing, I mean, that's the only thing I, you know, eat, sleep, and breathe is COVID and what it's going to do for us. And this is pretty much the only thing I work on now at this point.
All right. Hi, Ken. I think I was next. Thanks for talking to us today. You talked a lot about the things that you encountered in your career arc that you liked, but did you run into anything in the politics and foreign policy spheres that you didn't like? And can you talk about how you managed through that?
Yeah. So I think one of the more general things that has been a challenge is sort of figuring out, you know, I think like a lot of people, you know, came out of undergrad really ambitious, wanting to change the world, wanting to do all these positive things, and wanted to be sort of, okay, let me find the room where the decisions are made. Let me figure out where's the space where like the impact is actually happening. And finding myself kind of constantly frustrated that wherever I was wasn't quite the room. You know, I was in a senator's office. I mean, again, I was an intern, but like I was in a senator's office and I was realizing, wait, all these like outside organizations have way more time to think and shape policy than people on the Hill do, where they're frantically running about trying to do their jobs. So I went to a think tank, and then you're realizing, well, I'm spending all this time writing this report, and like I can't. I mean, and this is again, you know, a progressive think tank during a progressive administration with a lot of ties, and we still couldn't tell whether or not we were impacting policy at all. You'd be writing these things and going, well, the administration adopted this policy, but I can't even tell, was that because of us, or were they going to do that regardless? And so you're sort of like, maybe this isn't the place where it's happening. And I can't really tell the human impact of it. And that's part of the reason that I work at the organization I do now, is I wanted something where there was more of a human impact, right? So I go here to the IRC, and like, I'm working in the president's office. I mean, we're managing this organization. You know, I'm involved in sort of the big decisions the organization makes, but I'm sort of trying to figure out, well, you know, does this work that I did on this kind of random op-ed, is that saving anyone's life in, you know, rural Nigeria? I don't know. But I mean, honestly, even when I talk to colleagues that are in the field, I mean, everyone is sort of pointing somewhere else and going, well, this is not really where it happens. It's over there where it happens. I mean, even I was in Goma, DRC, which is Eastern DRC, the most impoverished part of the country. It's the provincial capital during the Ebola crisis. And all the people in Goma are basically saying, oh, well, the work doesn't really happen here. It really happens out in the field. And I was going like, well, this is what we consider the field, right? But even there, they're saying this isn't really where the action happens. So I think that sort of coming to an understanding, and when you go to the field, everyone tells you, well, it's really in government where all the action happens. So you have to go back to DC if you really want to make a difference. So I think just sort of coming to an understanding, accepting that anywhere you are, it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's never going to be the big picture. You're never going to be in the room where like, this is where all the stuff happened, and this is where all the decisions got made. You know, I've never worked in the White House, so maybe some folks feel that way there, but you know, I sort of find sort of coming to an acceptance that changing a humanitarian crisis, you know, preventing the sort of negative effects of a war, shaping better policy towards Iran. I mean, all these things are like, they're like turning an aircraft carrier. I mean, you know, it's really hard to see change in the moment. So, and you just have to take a really long perspective on what change looks like. So I think that's been a challenge that I've sort of had to come to accept. And then in terms of, you know, other things that I've struggled with, I think that I found myself frustrated by both the DC national security community and the sort of humanitarian community in terms of their inability to talk with one another and work together and sort of understand that actually sometimes they are at odds, but I think a lot of times, and more often than they're willing to accept, they're actually working in the same vein. My boss gave a speech, which I helped write to some cadets at West Point, really talking about how humanitarians and you know, soldiers actually have a lot in common in terms of challenges we deal with, the places we work, the things we're working for, and obviously there's a lot of differences. But I've actually found that very interesting. But I think that one of the challenges that I found in the national security community in DC, even in a progressive national security community, very little talk about humanitarian issues, only passing reference to refugees, very little, I guess, emphasis on the human implications of policy decisions. You know, you talk about, well, we should, you know, the US should arm X, Y, and Z rebels in Syria without really thinking about, like, what does that actually mean for civilians that are living in those communities, right? What is that actually going to do to their lives? Is that going to improve people's lives, or is it not? I go to the humanitarian community, and I'm sort of frustrated at the extent to which that they view politics and foreign policy as toxic, that it's sort of that they want to protect this sort of pure, clean humanitarian work without sort of realizing that actually politicians and military officials and foreign policy experts, like, they can be allies in this work. And so I've sort of been, and Samantha Power talks about this in her book too, but like, I think that divide between the humanitarian and the national security community is really frustrating, because I think that there are a lot of missed opportunities that come from, I think, mutual suspicion and mutual bias towards one another.
Thank you.
So we can go Pascal, and then Megan, and then Javier.
Hi, sorry, I'm on my phone, so I don't have my computer caught on fire, so I had to switch to my phone. So I'm Pascal. I'm studying philosophy, and my question is very related to what you were just talking about. And I was wondering, how much stock do you put into getting a foundation in personal experience with the people that you would be helping in the abstract, from, say, your like place in Washington, or your authority position, or your place in middle management? How important is it to, I guess, like filling the existential gap between the work that you do and the people that you help? How important is that in pursuing your career And do you think not getting those experiences, not getting that foundation and personal connection with the people that you would eventually be helping, how much that, like, missing that opportunity would hurt you going into your adulthood?
Yeah. I mean, I think that you can have a very successful career and never interact with anyone that's ever affected by the policies you work on. Like, to be totally honest, like, you can, and most people in DC have very successful careers without really ever, people in the national security space have very successful long careers without ever meeting anyone that's ever affected by a decision that they've made, or by a policy they've advocated for, or a war that they've supported, right? And I think that doesn't hurt them professionally, but I do think it makes their policy analysis, their policy recommendations worse. I think that it's important to sort of understand the implications of what you're doing. So I mean, it's, again, a big part of the reason that I came to work for humanitarian organizations. I wanted to see what that impact was a little bit better. And I mean, and honestly, it hits you emotionally in a very different way. I went to Iraq. My entire family had been back to Iraq since they fled as refugees, more than 70 years prior to that. And that was a really powerful experience, but it was right after the ISIS fight. And we went up to Mosul, and we're driving around West Mosul. I mean, this is 3-4 months after ISIS had been expelled by the Iraqi and US military out of Mosul. And I mean, you go to West Mosul, and it was every single building bombed and flattened. And you see people living in these bombed and flattened buildings because they're worried about, kind of squatters' rights and people kind of stealing their homes effectively if they don't rush back, even though it's basically rubble. And that, sticks with you in a really powerful way, just in terms of understanding the stakes and how long it's going to take, this sort of longevity. It's not just something that, you fight a war, things happen for a year or two, the war's done, and you move on. I mean, you're talking about generations that have to deal with this in the end. So I think I think it's important to understand that. But, to be honest, from a career perspective, it's not going to make a huge difference for you. I mean, I think, like I said, plenty of people have successful careers without doing that experience. But I think it's important. I think it's really valuable to have that experience and to sort of, have those personal connections. I think it's made me sharper in the way that I think about these issues. I think it's made me, I think it's kind of strengthened my backbone a little bit when I sort of, I have a tendency to sort of waffle on issues on the one hand, on the other hand. And I think that when you have that really personal, tangible experience, I think it really solidifies right and wrong in your mind, and what, maybe there's a decent argument for something, but I'm going to argue very strongly against it because I just believe that that's right. And I feel like what I've seen is convinces me of it. So, and I think, also it touches our life in slightly different ways than you might expect. So I mentioned I was in the Eastern DRC working on the Ebola crisis, and one of the biggest challenges we're dealing with during this Ebola crisis, and there was a lot of sort of vaguely racist commentary about, I can't believe these, Congolese are so stupid that they don't believe that Ebola is a real disease. They don't believe what the scientists are telling them in terms of, proper hygiene techniques, how to protect yourself. I can't believe these Congolese are so uneducated that they would believe that the disease was made up or imported by foreigners. And we spent a lot of time really thinking about community trust, strained relations between communities in Eastern Congo versus the central government that was telling them what happens when the central government brings in police and the military to force people to wash their hands, right? And what that does to community trust. And it's a thing I think a lot about now during the COVID crisis, where, a lot of people in our country are not believing that the disease is real, or are not listening to scientists, or have a lot of trust issues with, state, local, or federal government. So, I think that some of those experiences just also give you a little bit of empathy and sort of shape you in sort of interesting ways beyond the thing you're tangibly working on. I know it's a bit of a rambling answer, but that's sort of been my experience with it.
Yep, next.
Hi, I'm Megan. Thank you so much for talking to us. I'm a junior majoring in international relations, economics, and French. And I was just wondering, when you were looking for jobs and in humanitarian aid, did you look at other sectors, besides think tanks, besides these big international NGOs, and what appealed to you, what didn't appeal to you about those positions and that kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I got advice early on was sort of, I think that's sort of the usual way that most people do job hunts, and certainly the way that I initially tried to do my job hunt coming out of undergrad was I just went through like random job boards and job postings and went through a bunch of organizations and just found random jobs and just like submitted blind applications to them. And I applied for over 100 jobs, and I think I got, like I got basically 0 interviews from these random jobs I was applying for. And one of the things that, I got advice on, which I think is very good advice, is realizing that don't just randomly apply to things. Figure out a few organizations that you think like, this is a really well-run organization. They have values that are aligned with mine. I've heard good things from people that work there. Go do informational interviews with those places. Talk to people that work there. Talk to people in those departments. Do they actually, what an organization looks like to outsiders and what it's actually like on the inside are often very different. And I mean, and not just in terms of reputation, but even how it's structured, right? Like if you go to the IRC's website, how it looks like we're structured on the website has almost no relation whatsoever to how we're actually structured from a managerial perspective internally. So even understand like what's the actual department I want to be working for, you got to talk to people that are inside this organization to understand that. And what I found successful in my job hunt, both out of undergrad and out of grad school, was honing in on a few organizations that I really liked and believed in and had talked to people with good experiences. Like I said, I realized I wanted to work on refugee issues, but I don't have a humanitarian background. I never worked in a refugee camp. I don't really know these organizations super well, other than, I see their ads on Instagram and stuff like that. And I started talking to friends that actually did interact with them. It was like, what's your experience with them? How's the quality of the staff been? What's the quality of the programs been? And that really helped narrow my search down to a very small number of organizations. And I basically poured all of my professional and personal resources into finding people that work there and talking to them and applying to jobs there. So, so anyway, that's sort of a kind of broader thing on the job hunt. In terms of why this organization or another organization, I wanted organizations where they valued sort of flexibility and creativity. I wanted organizations that weren't super hierarchical, that weren't sort of like, this is the way we do it, and we're sort of not willing to adjust from that. So, talking to folks that had good experiences. And obviously, as you're early in your career, if you're early in your career and you're at a place that's hierarchical, you're going to be at the bottom of the hierarchy every time, right? So being in a place that's a little more flexible, a place that's a little bit flatter in terms of their management structure, allows you a lot more opportunities to do really interesting things that you may not be able to get to do otherwise. Like I mentioned, when I was at CAP, getting the opportunity to do writing on policy, on Syria policy, because I just like raised my hand in a meeting one day. I don't know that I would have got that at an organization that was a little more top-down, really rigid structures and stuff like that. So, but those things are important to think about. I think that one of the, I sort of got lucky, but I had a lot of friends that had bad experiences in their first jobs, especially out of undergrad, because they were spending 90% of their time thinking about, is the substance of the work what I want to do, right? Is it the right subject matter? And basically spent no time thinking about, is the boss I'm going to be working for a person that I'm actually going to want to work for? Is the organization well run? I mean, again, you don't think about things like, what's their sick leave policy, and like, how do they have an HR department, and like, what's the reputation of this boss in terms of how they treat their staff? You don't tend to think about that stuff when you're just desperate to find something that's in the field you want to work in, but that's what your experience is going to be. And generally what I found is that my friends that took jobs where they had bad managers, they were at organizations that did not treat their staff well. It didn't matter how interesting the work was. They left early. They had a bad experience. They didn't get to do a lot of stuff that was valuable for them. And the people that took jobs where they had a great manager that really supported them and encouraged them, they had were at an organization that treated their staff well, where they had some flexibility. It was good organizational culture. There weren't a lot of like scandals and issues they had to worry about. Even if the subject matter wasn't necessarily exactly the thing they were looking for, they ended up having a way better experience there and got a lot more out of those jobs. So it's the other thing I'd really encourage you to think about for those of you that are graduating. Don't just think about the substance of the job. Think about, what it's actually going to be like to work for that boss every single day and to wake up every single day dealing with whatever thing pops into their head that they want to deal with that day.
Hi, Ken. My name is Javier. I'm sorry there's a lot of background noise. My neighbors are a little crazy. But
no, it's all good.
you talked about the longevity of change, or that change requires to take place. And I know these are big questions to tackle, so I guess I'm more so just looking for your take on it, given your expertise and experience in these areas. But essentially, what can we do different? How can we rethink these organizations, these bureaucratic structures we have today to elicit more noticeable change? In terms of coalitions, what coalitions can we seek to build to better be able to do this? In terms of the divide between humanitarianism and national security, how can we bridge these together for an agenda that is more comprehensively related to both? I'm curious what you have to, your take on all of these big questions.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think probably the first, I mean, my number one piece, and it's something that I sort of learn over and over again, is that, you know, personnel is policy in a lot of ways. You know, the people that sit at the table are the people that inform the decisions that are made. And so, you know, if you have a community that's at the table that has a very similar perspective, you're probably going to get a set of policies that come from that perspective, right? And so diversity is, you know, gender, racial, but just also geographic, different life experiences, different career paths. I mean, these things are all really important, not because it's good to have, you know, a national security council that's 50% women, but because you're going to make better decisions and you're going to see things that, you know, different people are just going to see different things. You know, my family's background as refugees allows me to see different things. You know, my mother's an immigrant. You know, it allows me to see different things than some of my colleagues do. My colleagues that are not from, you know, the East or West Coast, but are from kind of more rural communities or, you know, in the Midwest, like they just see different things than I do. They spot different issues. I definitely noticed that in response to the COVID crisis. You know, like I said, it's what we're thinking about and doing. And, you know, there's all this question of like, okay, it's something we're thinking about, but like which units get brought in? Obviously, our health technical director gets brought in. Should our education technical director get brought in? Well, with 90% of kids out of school, probably. There was a debate about whether or not, you know, our gender-based violence team should be part of the kind of core team. But what we found was, look, you know, when domestic violence skyrocketing as a result of people being trapped at home with their abusers and a lot of our beneficiaries suffering from that, that's a really important piece to get a handle on. And they're, you know, our gender-based violence technical experts are just spotting different issues than we do. And I think that the same principle applies not just to a specific organization, but sort of in broader communities. I mean, I think that, you know, this is, I think, one of the other frustrations I've had in my career, but I different issues are gendered in very unnecessary and weird ways. So, you know, you'd sit in a room, and if it was a who are we going to war, who are we bombing, you know, who are we giving arms to, you can pretty much guarantee that every single person at the table was going to be a man. And even, again, even among, in a progressive community, it was pretty much only going to be exclusively men. And these were the real hard issues. And this is where the men were. And if it was a humanitarian refugee issues, we care about this stuff, but that's like the women's work. And you go to a roundtable on what are the humanitarian implications of who you're arming and who you're giving, you know, weapons to, pretty much only women at that table. And I think that is a really frustrating and really negative divide, and kind of cross-pollinating these different communities more and more. And I think being willing to sort of look for people with different professional and personal backgrounds as you sort of build these communities and coalitions, I think is really important. And again, it's one of the reasons why I'm so frustrated by the national security humanitarian divide, because it sort of forces people into different silos, when I think that, you know, bringing people with a military background into the humanitarian community, bringing people with a political background in the humanitarian community, bringing people with a humanitarian background that work in the field into the National Security Council, like these things will make better decisions. They'll be better thought out. You'll spot issues way earlier on. I mean, that's I think, and so I think that whether you're working in government or in an organization or working just in terms of, you know, building political coalitions to advocate for change, I think having a really diverse and kind of cross-pollinated community is really, really important in terms of establishing better change. But the other thing I'll say is that, take advantage of opportunities to rethink the world around you. And this is obviously, I mean, more than anything else in our lifetimes, been an opportunity to rethink the world around us. There's a great quote from Tom Stoppard who said that, the writer who said, it's the best possible time to be alive when almost everything you thought you knew is wrong. And I say that to all of you as you're finishing your classes or going through your classes or entering your careers. Everyone sort of there's a sort of bias towards what I know is just going to continue, and that straight line is just going to continue forever and ever. And that's just not the way the world works. You have these random sudden changes that only happen when you're willing to sort of question the sort of bounds of what is possible. And this is a great moment for questioning the bounds of what is possible and really rethinking our traditional ways of working that maybe we're realizing don't actually work that well.
Thank you for your insight, Ken. I want to be respectful of your time because I know it's 4 p.m. We do have 3 final questions. If you're okay with it, I was hoping we could maybe just go really fast through each of them and seeing if you can kind of lump them together. Okay?
Yeah, great.
Michael, Ceci, and Rebecca, you got like 10 seconds.
Okay, mine is pretty quick. Hi, Ken. Nice to see you again. I was just wondering what your recommendations were for networking in the nonprofit sphere, aside from like reaching out for informational interviews on LinkedIn.
Okay. Hey, Michael, go.
Hi, Ken. Thanks for being here. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the hard, like technical and quantitative skills that you've seen that are useful in the humanitarian field that would be worthwhile to learn now. Thank you.
And is it Becca?
Yeah, Michael's question is pretty much similar to mine, so we're good.
Great. In terms of I'll answer the quant skills question first. I mean, really what it's about is, I get a lot of times I'll get, an academic research paper on the effect of a particular style of programmatic intervention on early childhood education, right? And we're trying to decide, should we adopt that into our program model? Is that something that we should be investing money in as an organization to try to build that out or test that a little more? And just being able to look at an academic research paper with, the statistical model and the table and the p-values and just figuring out, like, what is this actually telling me? And being able to look, little things, just the sort of sign, size, and significance of a finding, right? Is it actually that significant? Is it statistically significant, but not that important of a fairly minor change? Is it potentially pretty huge of a change, but actually just it's still unclear because it's not statistically significant, right? Just being able to sort of read that and digest it on your own, I think is really important. When I was in grad school, the way that I sort of described what I was trying to do was, there were people in my class that took like the more advanced version of econometrics and quantitative analysis, where they were like, I want to work at the World Bank or the IMF and design a statistical model, or I want to run randomized control trials for JPAL. I want to be the person that's writing these papers and running these statistical models and spending all my time in Stata. And I don't want to do any of that. I just want to be able to have what they give me and be able to understand it. And it's, I think, effectively the difference between, how much do you need to know about a car? Do you need to know enough to be a mechanic that can fix an engine? Or do you need to know enough about a car that you can operate the vehicle and problem shoot minor things along the way and know when you need to go talk to a mechanic? And that's effectively what I was trying to do. I just wanted the latter where, especially a lot of the work I was doing on climate change. There's a lot of scientific papers, and I think a lot of the national security community gets scared away from climate change in part because they see these like scientific papers and sort of get worried about, I don't understand this, so I'm going to leave that to the scientists and not worry about it. It's not my thing. And I think, again, the sort of importance of cross-pollination, people from different backgrounds coming together, having national security foreign policy experts look at scientific papers and be able to understand them, engage with them, and what does that mean for a foreign policy perspective is really valuable. And so I think that's really what I wanted to get out of it, was just sort of just be able to read an academic paper and just understand what the hell I was saying. And then finally, just on networking, I spoke a little bit about narrow your search to a smaller number of organizations. So don't try to job hunt at 50 different organizations, right? Pick I had I don't know if he still teaches classes anymore, but Professor Glass is a USC professor that I had that, you know, he taught me a lot about networking, and basically he had me come up with a list of about 8 organizations, you know, 5, 10 max, right? Like, here are the different organizations I want. Then you can go to your Professor Lammy's or your, Professor English's or your, your internship supervisor and go, here are the 5 to 10 organizations I'm really interested in. Do you happen to know anyone at these different organizations? And what I would say is that when you're doing informational interviews, when you're talking to folks, the more specific you're asked, the more likely you have of actually getting converted. So if you came to me and said, hey, Ken, I'm interested in jobs in the humanitarian community, I'd be like, yeah, I mean, I can give you advice, but I'm not really gonna be able to help you much. But if you say, hey, Ken, I'm really interested in working in, with a humanitarian aid organization that's working in Colombia with Venezuelan refugees, and I'm really specifically interested in education. Do you happen to know anyone or have any advice for anyone? I can go name you 3 or 4 people right now that you should talk to. I'm happy to put you in touch with them. So the more specific you're asked, I think the better chance you have of it being converted. And on the networking thing, don't be afraid to ask for 15 minutes of someone's time. You know, you can obviously tell from the fact that I'm going over with this time, people love talking about themselves and their experiences. So you should not be afraid to ask people for an informational interview, ask about their careers. I mean, you'd be surprised how many people will say yes to a random request for a 15-minute phone call. Ask that person to put you in touch with 1 other person or 2 other people, right? And you just sort of build from there. But don't be afraid, especially while you're a student, to ask for those networking interviews. I mean, that's how I got every job I've had has been through networking and informational interviews. And most of the people I know have had that same experience. And I think there's an obligation to pass that along to others. And all of you, as you get internships and jobs and do informational interviews, your responsibility is going to be to do informational interviews for other people that are coming up behind you that need advice and need help and are moving to a new city and want to get your advice. So don't be afraid to seek that out, and then don't be afraid to pass it on.
Thank you so much, Ken, for everything. You haven't changed a bit. We made a contribution to the International Rescue Committee and make sure that they know that contribution was because of your intervention, as well as your boss spoke here a couple of years ago and did a really good job. So I think he was actually came out to see George Clooney or somebody else like that to get some money, but I'm sure he loved USC better than George Clooney. So thank you so much for being part of this, and we really appreciate the fact that we're trying to bring our alumni back, and especially alumni that are closer to the age to these kids, and helping them think about how they can make a difference in the world as you have done. And so we're very proud of what you've done, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you all so much for joining this, and don't be afraid to reach out to me.